Pleasant day to all of you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Computing Society of the Philippines for the opportunity, and I hope everybody is doing okay. And in response to our current situation with COVID-19, I decided to give a talk on different modeling strategies and framework to prevent and control epidemics toward a sustainable outbreak preparedness and response. In this talk, I will first briefly go through the epidemic risks that we put ourselves in this new era, and followed by presenting the systems models that can be applied to capture the spreading behaviors of diseases and to assess the interventions of control strategies to delay or stop the spreading of diseases. And finally, I'll present the framework that is composed of mainly the systems models that I'll be discussing. So, as a consequence of global mobility and climate change, uh, we are putting ourselves in a different kind of epidemic risk. Throughout the history, we have witnessed how epidemic diseases can be devastating. So, they cause economic loss and destroy lives. As a consequence of globalization, we are experiencing a new era of epidemic risk where infectious diseases spread in borderless world. So globalization increases the speed and volume of humans and including non-humans like animals, plants, and products mobilities. Um, Globalization introduces infectious diseases in new locations that changes the geographic distribution of how the disease actually uh, spread or move around. Hubs like airport, train station, shopping malls, you're the one who created them, and these places, these hubs, concentrate populations and increase contact rates. If we want to spread information, this is an excellent hub. However, for disease spreading, this is a terrible idea to concentrate people in this hub. These hubs are conveniently connected. Okay? So they actually allow people to mobilize from one hub to another hubs. However, if one of the hub got infected or there's an infection in that hub, the other hubs connecting to it might also be infected based on the strength of their linkages and connections, um, which eventually lead to epidemic spreading of diseases. So climate change also plays a role, or it also contributes to the global spread of infectious disease. As the climate change, um, habitats can also be altered, and diseases can spread into new geographic areas, which expose new populations to new disease threats. One example is global warming. It changes the behavior and development of some insects, bacteria, viruses. Like for example, in some cases, it increased the survival rate and exposing the population to uncertain disease threat. So take, for example, the effect of global warming to mosquito. So when the temperature gets warmer, it can actually accelerate the development of mosquito. It can reduce the incubation time for the mosquito to become infectious. And for some people, it implies that they will be storing more water in containers that serve as breeding sites for some mosquitoes. And this also provide longer active seasons for mosquitoes. For high humidity, this provides a high survival chance for mosquito. And then for extreme weathers, this sometimes may disturb or disrupt sanitation services, leading to mosquito breedings and proliferation. and exposing humans to mosquitoes after their houses are being damaged by extreme weathers. So, what is the spreading behavior of diseases? It's only when you know the behavior, then you can strategize, or you can look for a strategy how to avoid um, the the spreading or the epidemic spreading, okay, or how to eliminate it. So there are two main components, in my opinion, that makes a disease spread rapidly. How high is the infection rate and contracts the infection rate in contracting each individual, and how easy it is being transferred. So what are the common precautions people take after knowing how disease spread? Um, Now we all know that they either try to increase their resistance or immunity by keeping fit and eating healthy foods, or what we are doing now is to reduce contacts with people, especially in public and crowded spaces, until it passes through and enough people eliminating the disease. Or somehow this is known as the concept of herd immunity. So mathematical and computational modeling play important roles in the efforts that focus on predicting, assessing, and controlling potential outbreaks. So systems models are built and used as tool to capture the epidemic spreading behaviors and assess effectively the proposed interventions. So we present how these systems models can be used in establishing effective and sustainable surveillance systems to um, monitor and for people to respond to epidemic spreadings of diseases, and how policymakers can better define, make policy or rules in order to stop the spreading of diseases, or at least to slow down the delay the spreading of the diseases. Okay, let's start with the classical approach. In many instances, a compartmental model captures the average behavior of a large population, and it is sufficient to provide useful insight and to extract good information from available data. A compartmental model is comprised of interconnected compartments, where each compartment are considered to be homogeneous. So, as you can see in the illustration, you have the S, where you have blue individuals, so they're homogeneous. Okay. Um, and then you have the infected and the recovered compartments. It is used to describe systems that vary in time but not in space. That's the limitations of the compartmental model. And interactions between the compartment represents how components in these compartments of population behave to one another. So the components in the compartments of the model can either flow, okay, from one compartment to the other, or they can interact. Okay. The components in the compartments can only flow between each other if in the process of flowing, the compartments in one the components in the compartment changes its status as it moves the other compartment. Okay? But once it move or transfer to the other compartment, it becomes also homogeneous to the components in the compartment where it transferred or shifted. So each compartment is denoted by a state variable. Okay? Dynamical interaction of these state variables in the systems are usually treated using first order rate equations, or ordinary differential equations. So the rate of flows and the interaction rates represented by the arrows, okay, between the compartments. You have the parameters like mu, beta. Okay, these are the parameters of the models, which represent the rate of flow or interaction rates. And these parameters can be obtained either from observational studies, literature, or through estimations from data fitting of the model if you have data. So given the compartmental compartmental model, one can actually compute the basic reproduction number, which is the average number of secondary infections produced when one infected individual is introduced into a host population where everyone is actually susceptible. And sorry, okay, and this can be done. One way of doing this is you can use the next generation method as shown here, where you have the F matrix representing the rate of appearance of new infections, V plus V minus representing the rate of transfer of individuals into and out of the compartment, respectively. Okay. And given the compartmental model, one may also compute the equilibrium points for disease-free and epidemic, and then applying Van den Richter and Vatmov theorem can be applied to determine and prove the local stability of these equilibrium points. So this is what we did in our study for tuberculosis in the Philippines. We obtained a free equilibrium which is unstable, and then an endemic equilibrium which is locally and asymptotically stable. What this implies is that there's still a continued challenge to control tuberculosis in the Philippines, which is not so good, but that's the reality. So the population is assumed to be homogeneous, and we have 6 compartments in this model. So we have the SA susceptible and immunized group, SB the susceptible and partially immunized group, LA the slow latently infected group, LB the fast latently infected, I is the actively infected and undetected group, and T is the actively infected, detected, and treated group. So individuals may transfer from one compartment to another compartment, okay, with the corresponding rate of transfer shown in the schematic diagram. So when you simulated the model, we got the following projection for TB incidence and prevalence rates. We found that improving immunity, treatment success, and treatment duration, it significantly reduced the projected TB incidence in the Philippines. And to reduce the projected TB prevalence in the Philippines, we need to improve partial immunity, treatment success, treatment duration, and case detection. But what is interesting in our study is that we showed that improving vaccine coverage, or our model suggests that improving vaccine coverage will not significantly reduce both TB incidence and the prevalence rates of tuberculosis. So we also applied a similar approach in studying transmission dynamics of avian influenza. Uh, for humans, if they're infected, we don't kill them, we don't murder them. But for poultry, if they're infected, it seems like the best approach or the immediate instinct approach is to cull, okay, the whole farm, the whole birds or poultry in the farm. So what we try to do here is we try to find a better alternative to culling the domestic birds in controlling and reducing the spread of avian influenza. So we modeled the efficacy of implementing isolation and vaccination strategy to the birds. So in the vaccination model, we found that no matter how effective the vaccine is, if the majority of the population is not vaccinated, it is actually hard to control and prevent the infection. And we concluded that if we compare two strategy, the isolation strategy is a better strategy than vaccination strategy. We also applied optimal control on top of the compartmental model that we have. Okay. So in this optimal control approach, the SIR models or the compartmental models serve as the constraint of the model of this modified model. So we have a cost function represented by an integral function, and we try to minimize this function or maximize this function, this cost function, that satisfy the differential equation or the SIR models um, with control variables u, which is a measurable function. Okay? And the goal is to find a particular control variable u and state variables x that satisfies, that will minimize or maximize the cost function, okay, given the constraint. Next, we move on to applications of graph theory and hypergraphs. Okay, so this is actually represented by a network model. It's formed by uh, at least two basic components, the nodes and the arcs. The nodes are connected by the arcs defined by their relationships. And if you want to view this for infectious diseases are modeled to spread via the edges represented in this network model. So this is how we can visualize the compartmental model that we have using the network model. So there are several network metrics that can be used to characterize the topological properties of the network models. So for example, you can find the shortest path length and the network diameter. These are actually useful in determining the degree of connection between two nodes. It can pertain to the time needed, for example, for individual dynamic cell state to reach and affect the other individual. And you can also compute the degree distribution, degree centrality, and degree correlation. These are very useful to identify which individuals play a crucial or important role in spreading the diseases and decide whether these individuals are right to target to control the epidemics. Okay. Or, yeah. So based on their contact interactions, the dynamical states of the nodes may change accordingly. As you can see, it's changing its status with respect to time. And the network models are useful in, if you know how they are interconnected, then the individuals are interconnected. These are very useful in tracking sources and identifying the targets. And based on the type of network that you assume your network look like, you can also generate the corresponding simulations from the network models as shown in this slide, okay, to better visualize the dynamics of the individuals in the networks. In meta-population model, the entire population is divided into two distinct subpopulations, each with independent disease transmissions of dynamics and together with interactions between the subpopulations. So the subpopulations in each patch is a mixed homogeneously or is mixed homogeneously. So given an entire population, it's divided into distinct subpopulations, and these subpopulations interact with each other following a heterogeneous network. Okay? And this model keep track the number of individuals at different locations or patches. Okay? Note that the subpopulation in each patch is mixed homogeneously. The individuals are classified based on their dynamical states, like SIR. So individuals in the same subpopulations, okay, if they're in the same subpopulations, they may change their state from SI to R accordingly based on their interactions and disease dynamics. It's similar to the compartmental model. The subpopulations exchange individuals due to mobility from one subpopulations to another. So it is often assumed that these patches are interconnected with high variable strengths of connections. Or you can also visualize that's a macroscopic or microscopic level, where in the macroscopic level shown in the left, you can perceive a network with heterogeneous compartments or subpopulations. So these subpopulations can be heterogeneous to one another, okay? But the individuals in one subpopulations, they can migrate to other subpopulations with some defined diffusion probability. So that's how they move from one subpopulations to another subpopulations. And then on the right, for the microscopic level, okay, so that's within a subpopulation. So in each subpopulation it's contained with populations of individuals that are mixed homogeneously. So you have the SIR inside these subpopulations that also mobilize or move to other subpopulations. Okay, so there's uh, connections that allows individuals from one subpopulations to move to another subpopulations. Okay, another illustration within each subpopulation, as I mentioned. So, for example, you can see on the right side here. Okay, the subpopulation contains different dynamical status like susceptible, infected, and recovered. Okay. To better illustrate, let's look at first figure A on the leftmost. Um, the it shows the macroscopic level of the locations, and these locations can be household or institutions or factories. Okay, it also shows how these locations can be interconnected to one another. So, for example, a family member can be traveling to schools, to works. Okay, so this is how these networks or nodes are connected to one another. Okay, in terms of location. And then in figure B, in the middle, um, the individuals, okay, we have a bipartite network uh, associating individuals to the locations defined in figure A. Okay, and the arcs that connect them are weights pertaining to the time they spent in the location. Okay. Lastly, in figure C, we showed it's shown there a unipartite projection of the bipartite network shown in figure B. So what it provides is a contact network for the contagion process. So different transmission rates and weights on the network depends on where is the location and the type of interactions they have in the locations that they had been to. Okay. Now we move on to agent base. Okay. Before we discuss agent base, this is I considered it as a type of a special spatial model, and it's also a special type of individual based model. So for spatial modeling, individuals are located at different locations, and that the transmission infection between an infectious individual and a susceptible individual at distance x may occur in some probability as defined. Okay. And then for individual-based model, um, the stochastic epidemiological dynamics for each individual can be simulated explicitly with a set of characteristics, including, for example, you can define the epidemiological status, the spatial location, the interaction preference, and behavioral traits. So, agent-based model is one of the most popular spatial modeling and individual-based modeling tools that try to describe epidemics in geographic settings and with traits, okay, defined traits. These models employ the large-scale data of migration and interaction among the components. So, simulating these types of model, uh, these are usually based on probabilistic assumption, and it demand large scale of information input and intensive computational output. It also take into account details such as the transportation infrastructure of the simulation area, the mobility of the population, demographics, and uh, and the epidemiological aspects such as the evolution of the disease, okay, with the host and transmission between the host. Okay, so it actually serves as a good tools with a lot of details, and this is reasonably no violation of any kind of ethics, research ethics, um, and it has reasonable cost, timeliness, and appropriateness. Next is this is the last systems model that I will be discussing, and it's the application of natural language processing and machine learning. Um, this is this approach is useful because of the big data that we have. So the large data set that we have now is available in the internet. There's also a lot of open access databases where we can mine and extract data. And to quantify this data that describes social phenomenon and behavior patterns, we can actually apply NLP and machine learning approaches to automate the extraction of this information and analysis of this data. So, for example, there are some social communication platform and search engines like Google, Twitter, Facebook, okay, and some provide web search query data that are capable of tracking and estimating disease activities. So, the internet based platform um, for throughout the years have revolutionized in a way that private and publicly available information diffuses, which is promising for data mining and use as real-time surveillance for web-based tool. One example is how Ginsberg exploited the aid of search query on the Google platform for early detection of influenza epidemic in the U.S. Um, they uses several models and it was fitted using publicly available data they took from CDC influenza sentinel provider surveillance network. In this paper, you can also see that they um, use information from tweets that they gathered and they use it to estimate and forecast dengue at a country and even at city level. Whereas in this study, it proposed a framework that can be built to monitor seasonal epidemics like flu uh, by employing different data mining methods like text mining, link or graphical mining, and structural data mining methods. And then, if we want to study the virus in molecular level for drug development, there are also several things that we can do as a mathematician and computer scientist. So this is just a recent news 2 days ago. This was reported 2 days ago. It says that in this news they reported that one can also use mass spectrometry to detect early infection of COVID-19. So we now have the test kit, but test kit is also expensive and limited supplies of the test kit. Why am I bringing this up? Because mass spectrometry, um, um, mass spectro, this instrument, most of the hospitals have this, and it can generate cheap, fast data. Um, and as I said, it's an instrumental machine that is accessible by major hospitals. Um, and they reported that um, it can be used now as a tool to detect COVID-19. And I think this is this instrument, or the data generated from this instrument, is actually very useful, because a lot of hospitals are also using this to detect markers from diseases, and whether drugs will be compatible to these persons who may or may not express um, specific markers that the drugs is actually targeting. Okay, so it is actually important to give value in developing tools, for example, to develop tools that can enhance the analysis of mass spectrometry data, like detection of diseases or infection. So in this study, we applied this to detect pancreatic cancer, but if there are any tools already that uh, tries to detect specific markers, known markers, okay, or um, given the known markers to detect unknown new markers, okay, it might be helpful in um, finding biomarkers. And once the biomarkers have been identified, then one may actually cluster diseases or virus type, or species virus type, based on their similarities of the markers identified to them. Okay, and for diseases in this study, we tried to cluster similarities between diseases based on their pathways, biological pathways. And once you were able to find the markers, you were able to identify the similarities of the markers, biomarkers of the virus or diseases. Perhaps with the disease drugs graph, or that you can extract from the literature, one can also associate drugs developed for previous diseases, or I mean, it's probably use existing drug that have been used for other disease or infections, and treat similar diseases, or you use that to treat similar diseases or viral infections. Okay. Um, so at least there's a starting ground, okay, where the drug designer or developer know uh, where to start with, or maybe there are already existing drug that can also be used to similar diseases or infections. Lastly, for the modeling framework, um, so basically we have presented different model systems to understand the mechanism by which the epidemic spread, and the use of that, we can also use them to evaluate the effect of interventions that you propose, to predict epidemic outcomes, and to forecast future course of outbreak. So the modeling frameworks provide um, valuable, or at least some information that will be useful in making public health policy to prevent and control epidemics. Um, it's also it can also serve as an effective and sustainable, I would say, because you don't need actually much resources, but manpower, talents, and computers to do the models and simulations. Global surveillance tools, it can be used as a effective and sustainable global surveillance tools, and a mechanism to monitor outbreaks, predict outbreaks, and facilitate rapid and effective response to the using models. Uh, to conclude, epidemics, we now realize it that it's a big threat to the health of the public and stability of the economics. Um, Therefore, it's really important to detect the disease activity early and response immediately to reduce its impact and damages. Um, This can be done if we have a good monitoring system that can accurately and timely monitor or surveillance. Okay, monitor the risks and the incidence of the diseases through the frameworks that I just discussed earlier. These models propose, as I mentioned earlier, reasons of ethics, cost, timeliness, and appropriateness can be useful for public health research or public health epidemiologists and policymakers to prevent and control epidemics or future um, epidemics. For now, that's it. That's all for my talk. Um, and to end, I'd like to acknowledge Center for Complexity and Emerging Technologies of DLSU and Brother Albinus Peter FSC, Professor Chairs in Mathematics, and Brother C. John Linam FSC, Professor Chair in Mathematics. Thank you.